Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Richard Kuhl. I'm an associate professor at Royal Roads University in Victoria and the soon-to-be past president of the Confederation of University Faculty Associations of BC. Before I begin some comments, I'd first like to acknowledge with deep gratitude the generosity of Scotiabank, a major sponsor of this event. This is the 5th straight year that they've been a sponsor, and we sincerely hope that this will be an association for many years to come. Over the past couple of years, I've enjoyed sitting with and meeting Chelsea Park. Is Chelsea here? Chelsea Park here, who and her colleagues, other Scotiabank employees, and I'd like to thank them. They've been fun to sit with and other times, and I'd like to thank them and Scotiabank for the support of this event. Thank you. Yeah. I come, perhaps like many of you, from a family where neither my parents, grandparents, any aunts and uncles had ever graduated from high school. My parents supported my education, but themselves, through facts of history, really had little of it themselves. Yet I was welcomed into the world of learning, of inquiry and debate through the efforts of Rabbi Julius Bubek, who took a young kid and taught him dialectical analysis, through a grade 6 teacher who pushed me into an advanced grade 7 program, through Andy Callahan, my high school biology teacher, who helped confirm my interest in being a biologist and taught me essentially that there were two kinds of people in the world, biologists and people who wish they were biologists. And through my undergraduate employer and my mentor, science mentor, Dr. Art Borer at the University of New Hampshire, who taught me what really goes on in a lab. And through a philosophy mentor, Dr. Dwayne Whittier, who introduced me to my high Anglican rabbi, Alfred North Whitehead, and through my doctoral supervisor, Dr. Wayne Shuda, wonderful Mormon scholar who gave me my head and let me explore dimensions that made him at times nervous. I was welcomed to the world of education and then higher education. I was offered gifts that will be with me until my last breath by those teachers. My teachers, like the scholars, like the award winners here tonight, Matais Margulis, Michael Prince, and my dear colleague Ann Dale, and all who work in the academy really, we're welcomers. We at our best are those who offer members of our community, our students and colleagues, a door that's open and an invitation to walk through it. And for those who choose to accept the invitation and walk through the door, they can learn and discover, they can better serve others, and they themselves, as we ourselves, can be changed. This is the work of those of us who labor in the academy. We're welcomers. We can also be disturbers. But we come into this work, I think, not because we're considering, the return on our investment, which seems to be what governments might be telling us now as a metric by which students should judge our programs, but because we ourselves were welcomed in by people who saw who we were, even as little kids, saw who we might be and who we might become, who trusted what they saw and offered us a hand connected to the hand of welcome that was offered to them. There's a nobility in the work that we're called to do, and those being honored tonight really represent that nobility. And I'd like to also recognize that of all the academics honored by their colleagues tonight, there are others who aren't here, who didn't win this particular award, but they also all share in that nobility of purpose and pursuit. We're going to hear from those award winners after dinner. So please enjoy your meal. Mark will come up in about an hour's time to continue with the ceremony.
Thank you so much, Richard. And before I forget, let us thank our servers and the magical chefs behind the doors there for a wonderful meal. I'm quite pleased to be asked once again to MC the awards, the BC Distinguished Academic Awards from CUFA. Thank you, Robert Cliff, for asking me to come once again. And as you heard before dinner, tonight marks the 20th year now that CUFA BC has gathered together academics, politicians, university administrators, and others to celebrate public university faculty members who use their ideas in service to our communities. And I'm wondering if you can connect the dots here. What food security, labor conflict, deadly mudslides, and hearing loss all have in common? Well, They're all stories that we recently tackled on the program that I host, BC Almanac, on CBC Radio. And in each case, we called upon the expertise of a faculty member from a BC university. And this happens every day at your public broadcaster. You'll hear faculty from UNBC in the far north to SFU, UBC, UVic, Royal Roads, University of the Fraser Valley, also Vancouver Island University here in the south. And when CBC calls you, it's usually when you're just stepping out of the shower at about 6:30 in the morning, or when you're getting ready for your class, or you're preparing to make a presentation at a conference in Ottawa. And we ask for your considered opinion on the story of the day, or it could be the story of the hour. Then we ask or demand that you keep it short and to the point, please. Years of your research and sweat and understanding compressed into that 5-minute interview or a quick soundbite for the evening news. So our attention span in the media, kind of like hummingbirds fluttering around the feeder, and we do appreciate your flexibility and willingness to engage with us, and through us, our listeners, our British Columbia listeners, and our viewers. As Richard mentioned, tonight's also marking the 13th time that a CBC radio personality has emceed this celebration. And this is the 5th time for me, so I think I'm up for tenure, don't you think? Cheryl McKay, Susan McNamee, Bill Richardson, Priya Ramu, and our late colleague David Grierson, they have all been at the podium before me. And most of us are really unaware of the vast range of teaching and research activities that take place in our public universities. And even as somebody who talks to academics for a living a fair bit, I am really just scratching the surface because there are so many hidden layers. And that's why it is always a real pleasure and a treat to come to this event, these awards, and learn something new about our public universities and the people that you honor. They are always inspired choices. And to meet wonderful people as well, like tonight's recipients, who are doing interesting and important research, and that makes it a special night for me as well. And they're using that research, too, in service of the larger community. Now, at the end of this evening, a total of 42 BC academics will have been recognized for scholarly excellence and their contributions to the wider community through their research. Although only 3 people are being recognized this evening by receiving an award, there are many, many more public university faculty members who are also deserving of recognition. Now, the first award recipient this evening is Dr. Matais Margulis, a member of the Department of International Studies at the University of Northern British Columbia. He is this year's recipient of the Early in Career Award, sponsored by Scotiabank. Being a trade policy advisor for the federal government may be an unusual precursor to an academic career, but for Dr. Margulis, it was absolutely vital and essential. His interest in international politics led him to the position after completing a master's in political science at the University of Toronto. And as part of Canada's negotiating team to the World Trade Organization, Dr. Margulis experienced firsthand the politics of international trade. What struck him most about that experience was how disadvantaged the poorer countries were, particularly when it comes to domestic food security. And the desire to know how and why this was the case, that propelled him into a doctoral study program. And as he was nearing the end of his studies, a convergence of events led to him being asked by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, Dr. Olivier de Schutter, to write a report on the World Trade Organization and food security. Now, Dr. Margulis' novel analysis of how existing WTO policies constrain the ability of many developing countries to implement innovative food security programs. It's actually been highly influential. During a WTO meeting in 2013 on new agricultural trade rules, several governments made proposals that were based on his recommendations. And one of the outcomes of that meeting is the suspension now of international trade rules in relation to public food stockpiling, the programs that developing countries can now have. It's a major victory for world food security. Dr. Margulis is not content to limit his experience and his expertise to such rarefied proceedings, he recognizes that although technical analysis is important, that it's meaningless without the necessary political will to implement it. And to this end, he is translating his scholarly work to publicly accessible modes to inform him and inform us, really, and influence the international and national public policy debate over food security. And in the 3 years since his report for the United Nations, he has become a leading international expert in his field. For his ceaseless efforts in advancing world food security, Dr. Matais Margulis is the 2014 recipient of the Early in Career Award sponsored by Scotiabank. And Dr. Margulis, please come forward to receive your award.
Nice to meet you. I think we have to.
Make sure I don't drop this. That would be very embarrassing. All right. Good evening, everyone. It's a thrill for me as a recent migrant to British Columbia and to finally meet many of my colleagues as part of CUFA BC. So happy that we have some distinguished guests outside of the university here. So you sort of got a very quick overview of some of the things I've done sort of at the beginning of my academic career, and I was really thinking about this early academic career award. 3 years into my position, and I think at the third year stage, you're just like, holy moly, okay, I'm really a faculty member now. The students treat me like I'm a professor. This is really weird. So this is, it's an interesting moment to be in your career, I think, when you start to realize, yes, I'm really part of this profession, and then you start thinking of the next 30, 35 years to come. And I think maybe you can give me some advice on what those are like. But I really want to express how honored I am to receive this award and how important it is to me, because when I began my academic career, I really wanted to have one foot in academia, but have one foot in the policy world, speaking, trying to influence things. And I think particularly now when there's so much professional pressure on young scholars just to focus on your research, just focus on tenure, you're really not encouraged to do things outside of that a lot of the time in our profession. So I think it's really wonderful that we have an award that recognizes and encourages that kind of activity amongst young scholars. So I think it's a really wonderful award, and I'm really glad that it exists, and I'm very honored to receive it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things I probably want to do the next 5 to 10 years, and I'll just give you an overview at some of the ideas that I'm thinking about or the work that I like to do or am starting to do. And this kind of starts back in 2011. I was at a conference in Ottawa, and I was having a chat with an official from the Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture. And the official was telling me how every day he was getting these phone calls from overseas, from China, from Saudi Arabia, calling, can we buy land in Saskatchewan? And he was totally shocked by this, because, he said, sometimes I get a call once a month, but now I'm getting like 20 calls a day. This is, what's going on? And this sort of started, and I thought, well, what is going on? This is quite interesting. And I started to think about this. This is not just something that's happening in Saskatchewan, but it's really part of a global phenomenon that's been labeled by many scholars the global land grab. And what I want to talk to you about today is this idea of the global land grab as a sort of symptom of the triple crisis that we're facing right now: a crisis of food, a crisis of the environment, and a crisis of the economy. So many of you may have heard of the global land grab. We live in BC, we talk about land grabs a lot, but when I talk about the global land grab, I'm talking about this global scale phenomenon where we're seeing large scale purchases of agricultural land, usually over 5,000 hectares, so really quite large, primarily for industrialized, export-oriented agriculture. And I think the idea of a land grab is important because it really refers to the idea that there's major power asymmetries between those who access the land, who can buy the land, and often those who are using the land. And it's not just a simple transaction amongst market actors. And I think in addition, this really speaks to the fact that many people around the world are currently losing their land. So this is obviously something we understand very well in Canada with the history of colonialism, but this is a phenomenon that's happening again in the 21st century. And I think it's something we, as an academic and as somebody concerned with global justice, this is where my research is going. So as I mentioned, this triple crisis is really about an integrated crisis. It's the financial crisis, the environmental crisis, and the food crisis, and how they're all interlinked. So we can't really think of these as separate. So if I talk about the financial crisis, you might be thinking what goes on in major financial centers like Toronto, but these are really intimately related to food and to the environment, and increasingly so. So everyone here is very familiar with the financial crisis. I think most of you have investments and pensions, so it's something that's very real to you. But in the last few years, the global financial crisis has dominated media attention and concerns about the economic recovery in North America and Europe. And we see the lingering effects in terms of high unemployment and weak global credit markets still with us today, 5 years later. So 2000 and 2008 is the sort of time when the global financial crisis occurs. At the same time, I think, in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we've gotten a real sense of how the extent of the global ecological crisis, and in terms of the information that we've received from the IPCC, even most recently in its most latest assessment, just tells us it's much worse than we thought. So clearly we're at a point in time where, in terms of our knowledge of the global ecological crisis, we know it is worse than we thought potentially, but the processes are reversible, and that's why we really talk about mitigation and adaptation. We've passed a certain point with respect to the ecological crisis. But the third crisis, and the one that may be less well known to you or to many people in the North, is really the global food crisis, which occurred in 2008 and 2009 and since repeatedly. But really what happened in 2008 was, you can put it in, everybody's concerned today about, gas prices went up a lot, so everybody's quite concerned. But if in 2008, wheat prices tripled, and rice prices tripled. And this marked, for the first time in the post-war era, that food prices were on a serious upward trend. And this really marked an end of cheap food. We've really gotten used to cheap food, and our society is built around cheap food, and that is a change that is really important for long-term economic development around the world. And the crisis had a really profound effect on the food insecure, particularly in developing countries where people spend already upwards of 70% of their income on food. So if you think about, you're spending 70% of your income on food and your food prices double or triple, food becomes inaccessible to you. So this is really had a major, major effect, and according to the United Nations, we reached the first time in history where over 1 billion people were officially hungry. So the global food crisis is quite an enormous crisis, but yet has not received the kind of attention that the financial crisis has received. But I think the quick point I want to make with my time is that these crises are interrelated. They're not distinct. They don't operate in isolation to another, but they really are pointing to sort of new linkages amongst food, finance, and ecology that we're facing at the beginning of the 21st century. And so with respect to financialization, I just want to make a few quick points. But what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years is that global food markets have become financialized. So essentially, food prices are determined by commodity speculators and traders in Chicago. They're no longer determined by supply and demand. So something has fundamentally changed about the global food market, where financial actors are now really determining the price of food, but also where it goes. And food is increasingly linked to these financial activities. And many have argued, in terms of the research that's been done, that the major driver of the global food crisis wasn't supply and demand, but it was actually biofuels. And this brings us to another linkage between food and fuel. So many of you are familiar, whenever you fill up your car, something like 12% of your fuel comes from biofuel. And this has been something we've adopted in developing countries as a sort of a form of green energy. But one of the things that wasn't anticipated was how much of the global food stocks that would take out of food production, right? So we know that maize goes into your fuel. It's not leaving the markets where it traditionally went, such as animal feed or maybe processing for high fructose syrup. So we're seeing an integration between energy and food that had not existed previously. And as countries are increasingly shifting to biofuels, for example, it's not just North America and Europe, but China and India in the next 20 years want to have 20% of their fuel supply sourced from biofuels. This implies a fairly large-scale change in the global food sector. And this was really identified as one of the major drivers of the food crisis. Now we also know that energy prices and food prices are also linked, largely because most of our food is produced by heavy intensive petrochemical inputs. So again, energy, when energy goes up, food prices go up by a lot more. So these things are very complex and interlinked. But one of the really interesting developments in the last 5 years because of all these changes is what we've seen is this massive investment in global farmland that has really started in 2008. And according to the most recent data, something around 200 million hectares of land have been acquired. So this is something about 1.5 times the size of Saskatchewan. And it's not just any land, but it's the world's most high quality farmland. So there's a global rush to acquire farmland, largely not to produce food, but to produce biofuels. And so while this phenomenon is really unique and linked to this triple crisis, it does raise a whole bunch of new social concerns. Are we seeing a new era of land rushes, of neocolonialism, as some have called it, where we're seeing basically new enclosures on a global scale, traditional land users often being evicted, in some cases quite violently off their land. And we think, well, this is a process that's really, really far away from us, right? It's happening in Africa, somewhere in Asia, but it's not just happening in those countries. It's actually happening in every part of the world, in South America, Central America. It's happening in Australia, is trying to come to Canada, but luckily we have rules that seem to limit it. But in terms of, it's not just a very distant phenomenon, but it's something that we are intimately linked because your pension funds or your investments are part of that global capital, which is moving to acquire farmland. For example, the BC Public Service Pension is involved in major land acquisitions in Africa at this point in time. So I think it just reminds us that this triple crisis, it's not something that's distant and far from us, but it's really linked, to the food we eat, to the cars we drive, and to the financial decisions we make about our investments. So I think this triple crisis is pointing to sort of new challenges, and that requires new ideas and new knowledge. And this is sort of where at least my work hopes to move in the next 5 to 10 years. So that was sort of my TED Talk, because I was told to do a TED Talk. So that's sort of the overview of the triple crisis. So when you drive, what you've eaten, and when you check your bank accounts or investments, next week, hopefully you'll be thinking, how is this all linked to what's going on with the global land grab? So just once again, I just want to thank CUFA BC for organizing this wonderful event, for all of those of you involved in the decision process, for selecting me. I know that I imagine there's many wonderful people, so it's a real honor to get this. I also want to acknowledge the Department of International Studies at UNBC for supporting the nomination and moving it forward here. I also want to thank Scotiabank for sponsoring this award, and just thank you all again for the time to tell you a little bit about the triple crisis, and hopefully we can have some conversations when the music comes back on later on about it, and just really wonderful to finally meet more of my colleagues in British Columbia. So thank you.
Don't forget your check, Matthias, there. I'm planning a garden tomorrow after that. Thank you. And now I have another guest to add to our list of people to call around ALR issues in this province, which expands it. And good luck on your 5 to 10 year plan. Your early career award is going to take you a long way, obviously. The second award this evening goes to Dr. Michael Prince, the Lansdowne Chair of Social Policy in the Faculty of Human and Social Development at the University of Victoria. He is this year's recipient of the Ihor Bojanowski Academic of the Year Award. And I had the thrill of saying that for the first time, Ihor. That's very nice. Education and public service were well respected in Dr. Prince's family. Despite not having graduated from high school himself, Dr. Prince's father expected that all his children would attend and succeed in university, and they did. The day's events at Queen's Park in Ontario, Parliament Hill, they were regular topics around the dinner table, so it's no surprise that as Dr. Prince considered his program of study, public administration loomed large. A fortunate confluence of events led to Dr. Prince doing his doctorate and then becoming a faculty member at Carleton University, where he distinguished himself as a scholar of public policy. But just studying and teaching public policy wasn't enough for Dr. Prince. He wanted to get his hands dirty and make some policy, and he served as a consultant to a number of government policy exercises, most notably serving as research director for the Federal Social Policy Review, which was launched by Lloyd Axworthy 20 years ago. Dr. Prince has always believed that he has a responsibility, too, as a scholar, to put his knowledge to work in the community. He is often approached by the media, including yours truly, and others at CBC, by community groups, too, to make sense of the issues of the day. And on one of those occasions, he was approached by the parent of a child with a disability who was seeking advice and guidance. That led to a 25-year relationship with the disability community, assisting people with disabilities and their families to understand how policy is actually made and how they can advocate for themselves. His recent work as the co-principal investigator of the Disabling Poverty Enabling Citizenship Project has resulted in recommendations and action plans to alleviate the disproportionate poverty of Canadians with disabilities. As was said in one of his letters of support, Michael's work also offers hope. He dedicates countless volunteer hours supporting grassroots organizations. His work and commitment over the long term helps people with disabilities take their rightful place in Canadian society. For his work on the Disabling Poverty Enabling Citizenship Project and his decades of commitment to the disability community, Dr. Michael Prince is the recipient of the 2014 Ihor Boyanowski Academic of the Year Award. Dr. Prince, please come and receive your award. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. Here we go with our chairs in the back here.
Thank you very much. I want to first of all thank the Confederation Faculty Association of BC for this great honor. The writer Gertrude Stein once wrote that professors have two bad traits. One is they are logical, and the second is they are easily flattered. Well, tonight I admit to being delighted for this tremendous professional compliment, and it seemed going rational to do so. I want to express my gratitude to some people. First of all, Faith Lognar, who's the Executive Director at Inclusion BC, and to Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon, the representative of Children and Youth here in the province, for their very kind expressions of support for my nomination. Also to my colleagues at the University of Victoria for the nomination and for the many years of a positive work environment that I've enjoyed. It's enabled me to do the teaching I love, the research I love, the writing I love, my community work, and my media work. And I wish to thank my family. I'm delighted they're all here tonight, Karen, Jessica. In these remarks, I'd like to speak to you about some of my recent work in policy and practice with disability organizations. I want to do so in relation to the principle, one supported by CUFA BC, that anyone who can benefit from post-secondary education should be able to try and attain it. I want to speak about the difficult transition of young people with disabilities from high school to higher education. I want to first comment on the current status of youth with disabilities in Canada, then describe to you some of the policy landscape for young people with disabilities in this country, specifically in regard to education and to work opportunities. Then share with you some ideas on reforms. It's always about the action, always about the change, always about a better tomorrow for all Canadians. So reforms to better enable transitions to post-secondary education. So what is the situation of youth with disabilities currently in Canada? Well, for the past quarter century, social surveys have consistently confirmed that Canadians with disabilities remain one of the most undereducated and unemployed groups in the country. We know that the average educational attainment for people with disabilities is lower than for people without disabilities. people with disabilities are much more likely to have only high school education or less than their counterparts. In addition, a lower proportion of young people with disabilities graduate from a community college, a technical institute, or a public university. Looking at employment, we find that a higher proportion of young people with disabilities in this province and this country are more likely to hold multiple jobs in a year. They're more likely to have jobs unrelated to their education. They're more likely to not be working or attending school, and therefore they're more likely to live in low-income households. This means that many young people with disabilities are more likely than their counterparts without disabilities to be in non-standard precarious jobs, to be underemployed, to be without employment, and to be in poverty. So how do these young Canadians fit into the social policy landscape? Well, public programs for Canadians with disabilities are all too often a disjointed patchwork. Nowhere is this more evident than in programs for youth with disabilities. Transition planning and employment preparation for young people with disabilities are insufficient and ineffective in most parts of Canada. There are encouraging practices, and we have made some significant advances over the last 20-odd years. For example, success happens when plans are in place with facilitators in high schools who work with parents and families, work with high school teachers and local school districts, and area employers and potential mentors. It works when the aim is to secure meaningful work experiences and paid employment while the young person with a disability is still in high school. Challenges exist, however, across the country in identifying available jobs and having readily accessible transportation, especially in rural and small communities. Challenges exist, certainly in BC, for the school districts right now, facing the distressing prospect of reductions in special education assistants, speech-language pathologists, and other supports for students with special needs. Aspirations for gainful employment are not always promoted within the school systems or by families, who perhaps logically or understandably see few opportunities in the labor market or in post-secondary education for their son or daughter with a disability. Work co-op experiences are often unavailable. Parents may understandably feel too busy, too tired, too worried to see the employment potential of their teenager with a disability. Unintentionally, the focus of teachers or school administrators may be on what the young person cannot do because of their impairment, instead of on what they might do or on what they could be able to do in a setting with appropriate supports. The resulting alternatives without those supports are usually to stay at home, go on provincial social assistance, attend a day program, or perhaps a sheltered workshop. Finally, what are some reform ideas to better enable transitions to post-secondary education and employment for young people with disabilities? This goal requires closer cooperation and new investments by provincial governments and school districts in conjunction with the support of local employers, teachers and counselors, parents, and their families. Policy development will require changes in the traditional practices of student advising, summer job programs, and yes, in post-secondary institutions. To promote inclusive learning environments, we need to invest in accessible educational and work training facilities, provide a mix of classroom training and work experience, and support longer-term programming rather than just short-term activities and pilot projects. In this regard, provincial governments must play a leadership role by providing accommodation grants to colleges and universities, by funding direct services and on-site supports for post-secondary students with disabilities. Of course, the BC government already does some of this, as do virtually every other provincial government. They do this through access grants for students with a permanent disability, adult special education, and disability support services. But these programs and others need to be reviewed and modernized. The Council of Ministers of Education Canada ought to identify students with a disability and post-secondary education as a priority theme. Surprisingly, it is not a priority at present. It should be. Under this new theme, ministers can focus on students' transitions from high schools to post-secondary education, look at financial assistance to both part-time as well as full-time students with a disability, and and examine best practices on how we're advancing towards more inclusive and accessible learning environments in the country. Our universities have much to share with one another on this noble goal of inclusive higher education. Further, it is time that the Canada Social Transfer, the funding mechanism for post-secondary education from the federal government to provinces across the country, it's time that the CST be given a new policy focus, one suitable to our moment. A new focus in addressing the learning needs of the most vulnerable Canadians. A case can be made for using the federal spending power in a more purposeful and focused manner. We know that Canadians with disabilities are among the most disadvantaged citizens when it comes to education and employment. A new specific goal of the Canada Social Transfer would be to improve the post-secondary education participation of young men and young women with disabilities. Only then will the commitments Canada signed in the United Nations Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities of 2010 be realized. Only then will all youth with disabilities have a reasonable opportunity to access and attain post-secondary education in their province and in their country. So with this award, thank you again. We're honored to be recognized in this important work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Prince. Your commitment is inspiring and important, and may we see the better tomorrow that you're speaking of. Well, our final award recipient this evening is Royal Roads University Environment and Sustainability Professor, Dr. Ann Dale, the 2014 recipient of the Paz Budadal Career Achievement Award. The product of a family of teachers and public servants, Dr. Dale may not have become an academic if it were not for a high school teacher who kept her on the straight and narrow, and she vowed to repay that kindness and became a teacher herself one day. But before that happened, she had an extensive career as a federal civil servant. Her postings to the newly formed Federal Economic Development Agency in Atlantic Canada in 1986 fueled her interest in communities and helped her to develop the communication and facilitation skills that would play a vital role in later years. She next went on to be part of the team that set up the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, a unique multipartite organization which was created to advance a federal agenda for sustainable development. Working with governments, the corporate sector, academics, and environmental advocates, the Roundtable focused on what brought people together rather than what divided them. Dr. Dale left the federal government in 1993 to continue her work in sustainable development by helping to establish the Sustainable Development Research Institute at the University of British Columbia. Drawing upon her connections and considerable skills as a communicator and an organizer, the Institute did become one of the leading-edge sustainability research institutes in Canada. And while at the Institute, she started her doctoral studies, which she completed in 1999 at the age of 50. That's inspiring in itself. Newly minted PhD in hand, Dr. Dale became a faculty member at Royal Roads University, where she continued her efforts to work across, quote, solitudes, silos, and stovepipes, unquote, to build sustainable communities. A consummate communicator, Dr. Dale uses all the media at her disposal to promote the need for sustainable communities. And in addition to the usual journal articles and books, Dr. Dale developed e-dialogues to communicate public policy beyond an academic audience to policymakers and to the general public. And she's led over 30 conversations to date on critical public policy issues such as the risks and management of used nuclear fuel, sustainable urban development, and sustainable food systems. For her career-long commitment to building sustainable communities and her relentless efforts to increase civic literacy around sustainable development, Dr. Ann Dale is the 2014 recipient of the Paz Budadal Career Achievement Award. Dr. Dale, please come and receive your award.
Thank you very much. There is no greater honor than to be acknowledged by one's peers. I am privileged to receive the Paz Budadal Career Achievement Award for this year. I am also very pleased that we are joined tonight by Paz's beloved children, Maria and John. I would like to take this opportunity to thank a few people, remembering, of course, that it is not the Academy Awards. I would especially like to thank my second family here in Vancouver, Bogue and Maria Bibiki, whose love and support has contributed greatly to my work away from my own family. And next, my university, my colleagues and friends who are here tonight. Royal Roads is a very special place for me, a small but a very beautiful campus that allows an extraordinary creativity and diverse applied research. And as well, the wonderful young people that have formed part of my research team throughout my Canada Research Chair. Professor Budadal changed the Royal Roads landscape. She was a friend and colleague to many through her generous intellectual sharing and widespread community engagement. Besides her infamous phrase that inside every Chilean, there is a dictator, she once gave me some advice when I was in conflict with a colleague. Don't be angry, Anne, kill them with love. We live in a time when the pull and the push and the pull of the future is highly uncertain. Indeed, many argue precarious. Many believe we have a dysfunctional view of the future, grounded in old models and capable of solving modern day challenges. I am particularly aware of the recent release of the 5th IPCC report on climate change as I make my remarks. So, how do we break out of the old models? How do we change the conversation and re-enlarge civic space for the new conversations that need to happen? Are we even asking the right questions? I would now like to highlight some of my research outcomes from the last 10 years of my Canada Research Chair, my field work in Canadian communities, and my virtual work leading real-time online e-dialogues. So what have we learned? The importance of getting your house in order. There are 4 stages in how an ecosystem develops. They move from exploitation to conservation, or maintenance of the system, to release, to renewal. We are stuck in a cycle of exploitation, back to conservation, back to exploitation, with very little invested in maintaining systems for community well-being. There is billions of dollars in deferred infrastructure maintenance in this country, and the time is now here to move to more new sustainable infrastructure choices as we move to address this deficit. And at the same time, by increasing energy efficiency of our built environment, we simultaneously reduce costs and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, a win-win scenario. My work has focused very, very much on dialogue. We are storytelling creatures. We develop meaning and purpose through our stories and share common goals for the ways forward, so critical for democracy. Healthy communities are those communities that are engaged in conversations about what is important to them, engaging in civic dialogue around what they want to sustain, their values, and how to ensure those values are reflected in their elected officials. A critical question we have to ask ourselves is how has one story become so dominant around the globe that perpetual economic growth is necessary for human well-being? Just as we are storytellers, we are also social animals. With the wealth of information, science, knowledge, and local innovation in this country, how do we optimize this? Through social capital. That is through our relationships, our networks, both within and across groups, bonding and linking social capital. Linking social capital includes bridging, which is across networks, and vertical capital, moving up the hierarchy, upwards. That is, accessing resources outside of one's own direct community. And the difference between getting by to getting ahead for a community is all about human agency. The will or intent to act, an a priori condition to social capital formation. What makes one single resource community able to transition from an economic downturn while another collapses? What makes one individual able to transform from a personal tragedy and others hit the street? We are biologically driven social animals, so the answers lie in changing homophilic networks that keep people trapped in maladaptive behavior and similarly, static peer networks that reinforce the old models and inhibit innovation. Innovation. Since we are dealing with messy, wicked problems, they cannot be addressed by our current institutional, and forgive the phrase, solitude, silos, and stovepipes. These wicked issues are also broad, horizontal, and cross-scale, beyond any one sector of society or governments to solve. We need unprecedented and novel ways of scaling up and out the many local social innovations that are occurring across this country. And there are numerous local innovations occurring throughout this country. We still have, though, an east-west. We still have large versus small divides that we have to bridge. Social innovation is inherently collaborative. It cannot be done in isolation. It demands working with and through diverse groups of researchers, practitioners, policymakers, and civil society leaders, through partnerships, strategic alliances, coalitions, transdisciplinary research teams, and networks. And we need government leadership to implement policy alignment within municipalities and policy coherence between local, provincial, and federal levels, as agency and social capital are fungible. The rules of the game can destroy or build capacity. Changing the story. It is clear that the gross national product no longer measures what is important to the well-being of Canadian communities. We lurch from boom and bust cycles of resource exploitation rather than sustainable resource development. Let's start talking about the new development models that integrate the three imperatives: ecological, social, and economic. Moving beyond carbon neutral buildings to carbon restorative buildings, what we have called third generation sustainability responses, and others at that UBC place, regenerative sustainability. We designed our way into our modern day challenges. We can redesign our way out by reintegrating form and function and the three imperatives. To conclude, looking inward, the Academy has a critical leadership role in changing the conversation, daylighting the new narratives, pushing our research outcomes out to communities in which we live. But we need to build a new collaborative post-secondary landscape of colleges and universities, the large partnering with the small, with communities, working together to accelerate the take-up of research and social innovation, a vibrant intellectual ecosystem that equally embraces the theoretician, the academic practitioner, the public intellectual, and the educator. And to John and Maria, your mother was very wise. It really is fundamentally all about relationships and love. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dale. And here's to healthy, sustainable communities and the dialogue that you're encouraging as well. And I'm getting more ideas for more radio programs as I listen to each of these wonderful presentations. Thank you again for the invitation to be here. CBC thanks you for your letters of support. After another round of cuts, I don't want to have a downer end the evening, but you may have heard that we're losing 657 more employees in the next year. And I know universities are facing struggles too in terms of funding, but the letters that you write to your MP do make a difference, I think, hopefully, ultimately. But CBC thanks you too for being there every day for us when we call upon you for your expertise. And it's all part of the community dialogue, which is really quite an honor for me to be a part of every day on the open line program that I host, BC Almanac, where British Columbians can actually talk about a lot of these ideas and exchange that. And often it's people in this room too who are a part of that discussion. So thank you on behalf of CUFA BC for attending this evening and sharing in this 20th celebration, here, of outstanding researchers and their contributions to the community beyond the Academy. And even with just 3 examples, it's plain to see that university-based research and scholarly activity has both immediate and generational benefits for all of us. And I'll now turn the podium back to Dr. Cool for some closing remarks. Doctor?
And congratulations to all the recipients. It's wonderful to honor such wonderful colleagues. This is the end of my term as CUFA BC president. Next time around, Dr. Doug Baer of the University of Victoria Faculty Association, the newest academic union in Canada, will be the president. I'd like to thank all of those people who've contributed to my learning through this time, the Faculty Association presidents who are here and were introduced, the colleagues and friends I made from the faculty associations across the country, and the associations of faculty associations like our friends from Ontario and Alberta, and more locally the good folks that George represents from the Federation of Post-Secondary Educators of BC. I need to thank Rob Clift. Where is Rob? Back there. He deserves a round of applause. I need to thank Rob for organizing this event, of course, but even more so for his long service to the higher education enterprise in British Columbia. And I would in particular like to thank the presidents of the research universities who are going to be meeting here in Vancouver tomorrow for their willingness to consider an invitation to engage in a simple conversation about what's going on in our institutions with CUFA. We can stick around here and drink and talk. I'd like to wish you all the best and safe travel home.